We don't celebrate enough, Bishop Miles thundered to a bunch of Build leaders more than once, and he is so right. When we helped secure $1 billion for city schools, and before we celebrated it, we were already bemoaning the fact that it would only rebuild a quarter of the city schools. This week, we gathered to celebrate the extraordinary results of our community housing work in Greenmount West and Oliver, and now Johnson Square. Greenmount West and Oliver are two of the only neighborhoods in the city where population has increased, crime has decreased, property values have increased, and no one has been displaced. Listen to this. Over a 10-year period, the population in Greenmount West grew by 31%. In Oliver, by 48%, while overall city population declined. In Greenmount West, median property values increased by more than 2,000%. In Oliver, over 700%, building black wealth with lifetime locks on hundreds of units to keep them affordable. Homicides decreased by 75% and 50% respectively. We should be shouting, hallelujah. We've gifted the city of Baltimore with a strategy that works to resurrect the vacants and stop population decline. But after a hand clap, a celebration, what do? We move immediately to the truthful answer. Well, that's not enough redevelopment to change the trajectory of the whole city. That's only reaching 2 neighborhoods. That's not good enough. What's next? Our congregation, if truth be told, is very similar in this respect. Though we now have an endowment that has topped $7 million for the first time ever, and congregational giving has increased through the pandemic, the conversation is almost always about why our spending rate isn't perfectly on the mark. Though our trustees have long left behind the yearly emergency allocation from the endowment to fix some facilities emergency and is now firmly established in a team-based, long-term, sustainable approach with a building reserve last month that topped $100,000, the last meeting I went to was really focused on anxieties about how we're going to pay for the next tower that needs repair. Though our worship is pretty amazing these days in person and in hybrid form for those who have health needs to keep them at home, or just those of you who like to roll out of bed in the morning a little late on a Sunday, what do we often focus on at staff meetings? It's a dropped link, an audio mistake. Why isn't Michelle's microphone working today? Or one of us looking at the wrong camera. We don't celebrate like we could, which I've come to see as part of our congregation's particular personality. I realized this a few years ago when working on my own personality type through a continuing education event on the Enneagram. The Enneagram, for those who are not familiar, is a kind of cross between something like the Myers-Briggs personality typology and Christian mystical spirituality. The Enneagram describes 9 different personality types that are interrelated, and I've found it to be a profound tool for self-understanding, especially because of its conviction that the personality strengths that one has are often the very things that can limit our growth when we become overly fixated on those strengths as the only things that define us. Every Enneagram type has a basic fear, a basic desire, a basic vice, and a basic virtue. I'm Enneagram type 1, aka the reformer or the perfectionist. The basic fear of type Enneagram 1 is fear of being bad or corrupt. The basic desire is integrity, to be good. The basic temptation is hypocrisy or hypercriticism. The basic vice is resentment. The basic virtue is serenity and the wisdom of discernment that comes about as a result. That's all been interesting to me personally, but what rocked my world a bit was when our Enneagram trainer asked us to try to type our own congregation. I realized almost instantly that Brown Memorial collectively is most likely the same personality type. People come here who want to be good, who want to participate in a life of integrity, who want to be a part of bettering themselves and the world around them. And since that aha moment, I've been reading my daily devotional Enneagram thoughts that I meditate on each morning with respect to the congregation as well as myself. Here's a little sampling with my editorial additions. November 5th, Brown Memorial. Remember, your outstanding healthy qualities include caring deeply about the dignity of your fellow humans and maintaining strong personal convictions. Notice how you express those today. October 22nd. A strong tendency of your personality is to try to improve your partner, family, and friends with your rationality. Today, can you allow them to be themselves and learn from their own mistakes, Brown Memorial? October 21st, remember your passion is anger, more accurately described as resentment. Today, Brown Memorial, notice if you are fuming over other people's mistakes and incompetence. October 20th, take a moment to be quiet. Let the voices in your head tune down a bit. Perhaps your worries or anticipations or problems, Brown Memorial, can be experienced in a new light. Now, I don't know Hannah's personality type, but today she chooses to celebrate. Just a prayer celebrating God's power and faithfulness, which, is kind of a waste of time for a type 1 congregation. I mean, we will tolerate it in worship for a small part of the hour, as long as the choir does it to our high perfectionist standards. But what we really want to hear about in worship is what we're supposed to do. What we really want to hear about in our education is how we are improving ourselves and the world around us. What we really want to know about is how can we get better together. Now, of course, some would say that Hannah was made better by God. Her situation was made better anyway. It seems like she got her prayer answered. A barren woman in a world that marks women's value primarily by the children they produce, she received the child that she asked for. A specific prayer specifically answered. But Hannah's world went on falling to pieces all around her. The temple leadership is pronounced as totally corrupt in the next chapter. She still had to go home to her husband, whose response to her tears in the last chapter was, "All this focus on your barrenness is hurting my feelings." She had to go on in the world as a mother who had given up her child to God's service. No easy thing. And yet still, she took a moment to celebrate. She received something that she most wanted from the God who became her source of praise. Now, let me take a moment and say that if you are starting to feel a bit offended, don't worry. If I had tried to preach this sermon only a couple of years ago, I would have offended myself. It would have struck me as, hey, I know there's a lot of bad stuff in the world and hard stuff in our lives, but can't we just focus a little more on the good things? I know the earth is burning up, the city's falling apart, the nation might turn back to what we just got out of recently, but can't we just ignore all that and do some celebrating instead? That is the way I would have heard it. I would have ignored the fact that celebration is the finale to our stewardship series on the habits of faith, turn to the gospel reading instead with its wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes and famines, the sobering stuff, which is what the world actually seems like today and way more interesting for a type 1 Enneagram. I mean, the world is headed to collapse. It's all predictable. I told you so. If only people would do what they were supposed to do, stand firm, people of integrity. You can do this. But what changed for me a few years ago is recognizing that nothing that any of us does together is going to substantially change those giant global problems overnight. Organizing for climate justice takes persistent, consistent effort, personally and publicly. Baltimore's redlining took generations to bring us to the point where 3 new vacants appear every day in our city. It is going to take persistent and consistent effort to get us to the point where we are rebuilding more than those 1,000 homes that we are losing every year. We cannot change that overnight. The political situation is not going to suddenly right itself with one big march or one big event. We just had one. It's called a global pandemic, and it's revealed our fissures. It did not heal them on its own. Given all of that, we could toil ourselves to death trying, and we would still have to find a way to live in the midst of injustice that will take decades of sustained pressure to repair. So here's the deal. I want to be part of that change. I know you want to be a part of that change. Those are givens. The question is, how then are we going to live in the meantime? How are you going to live in the midst of the kind of chaos that Jesus speaks about in Mark? How are we going to live in the midst of the kind of wickedness, as 1 Samuel calls it, that Hannah experienced in her time? Hannah chooses to celebrate the gifts that are given on the way, in the midst. And it's not her only mode of prayer. In the first chapter, she prays her tears. She prays her despair. She prays her desperation. I believe God welcomes all of the above. But when she experiences her joy, she marks that too. She takes the time to feel it and express it, which is another way to say she values it in her life. This sermon series grew out of conversations with our stewardship team about the fullness of what stewardship means for our lives. That we and our world are gifts, and our faith helps us to value and care for those gifts and honor the source of those gifts in a diversity of modes expressed in our community's life and worship together. The long process of slowly arising from the pandemic has put an exclamation mark on our need to gather, to listen to one another, to proclaim this gospel of hope. It has emphasized for us how important is our own response to God's call, the multiple opportunities to be sent into the world, and the way in which our hunger for communion with God and with one another is granted in small but specific ways in and through the community of faith. But even with all of that, it's so easy to lose sight of God's dream for us and for our world, which in the end looks more like a party than a business convention. It looks more like a party. Perfectionists become healthier, the Enneagram argues, through self-acceptance. This is not the same as permissiveness. It means that we have to accept the world and ourselves as we find them and work with what we've got. Work with what we've been given. Now, get this. I used to think that believing that would make me less of a reformer or less of a faithful one anyway. But I've come to experience the opposite. When ones move toward that healthy place, they better reflect the qualities of joy, enthusiasm, curiosity, and open-mindedness, the very qualities that give us the energy for those struggles for justice and the building of community which is necessary to achieve it. Paradoxically, by accepting themselves and the world as they find it, reformers become better equipped to become even more discerning and more effective in changing the world around them. So go and do all your good work, Brown Memorial. Respond to God with your whole lives, including your pledges this morning, with discipline and care that reflects your deep-seated desire for integrity. Just be careful not to neglect this mode of celebration on the way. Reflected in Hannah's prayer of recognizing the miracles that do take place, the transformation that does happen, the joy that is experienced in the midst of hard times, joy that is offered to you as a gift from a God whose goal, after all, is not to create a world of dour, self-righteous reformers. It is not. But a world where joy and freedom are experienced by everyone, including you.